The human colony on Rinnar was small and fragile. The planet had been colonized only a few years earlier, and the settlers were still adapting to the harsh alien environment. They had no real defenses, and no hope of survival against the Kelfar. The alien empire had considered humans nothing more than a nuisance, at first sending occasional patrols to assert their dominance. But now the time had come for something far worse. The Kelfar had decided to make an example out of humanity, showing the galaxy that no species could resist their rule. The humans received a message from the Kelfar fleet that filled the colony with dread. It was an announcement of a gift, or what the Kelfar believed to be a gift to worship, a relic of an ancient conflict, a massive craft that had been slowly rotting away for centuries. It was barely functional and barely capable of holding together. The Kelfar called it the sinking coffin and insisted that the humans take control of it. Captain Ariane Hayes stood at the command center of the colony's small flagship, staring at the message in disbelief. Her first thought was that it was a joke, but the cold emptiness of the Kelfar fleet was not something to be taken lightly. They truly thought this ship would break their spirits. They thought the humans would see it and surrender in shame. They thought the sight of the wreck would be enough to make humanity abandon any hope. Hayes took a deep breath, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her people's future pressing on her shoulders. The fate of the colony rested on what she decided to do next. She could give up. She could tell the Kelfar to take their worthless ship and leave, but she knew that would be the end of humanity's resistance. There had to be another way. She turned to her second-in-command, Lieutenant Michael Davis, a seasoned fighter who had served with her for years. His expression was grim, but determined. He knew exactly what she was thinking. "We can't let them win," he said. "We need to make something out of this. We have to show them we're not done." The decision was made. Hayes gathered the crew of engineers and scientists to examine the ship. It was a derelict hulk, a floating graveyard. But it had power, it had systems that could be revived if they had the knowledge and the will to do it. The humans had nothing else to rely on. They had no resources, no weapons, but they had their minds and their unbreakable spirit. As the crew worked day and night to restore the ship to some semblance of life, Hayes found herself wandering through its empty corridors. The once grand vessel was now a shadow of its former self, but something about it felt like a challenge. It felt like an invitation to rise above the impossible. The Kelfar thought they had broken humanity, but Hayes knew better. They had just given humanity a chance to fight back. Weeks passed, and the ship began to show signs of life. The engine sputtered to life, and the first weapon systems flickered on the sinking coffin was starting to awaken, and the humans aboard it were starting to feel a spark of hope where before there had been only despair. But they were running out of time. The Kelfar were not known for their patience. The humans had to be ready before the invaders arrived. They had to make the ship a weapon, something that would prove the Kelfar wrong, something that would make them regret ever underestimating humanity. And so the work continued. With every turn of the wrench and every repair, the crew's hope grew stronger. They would not go quietly into the night. The sinking coffin would become their symbol of defiance. It would be the foundation of their fight back against an empire that thought they could crush them once and for all. The crew worked around the clock in the dimly lit hull of the sinking coffin. Each moment was a step closer to something unimaginable, a rebirth from the wreckage. The ship was a monster of alien technology and human ingenuity welded together in desperation. But with every passing day, the crew found more ways to make it something to fear rather than a relic to be mocked. Captain Hayes stood at the command center again, watching the chaotic yet purposeful movements of her crew. They had learned to work together as a single unit. Everyone had a part to play. The engineers were figuring out how to salvage the ship's reactor, while the weapons specialists worked tirelessly to rig the ancient energy cannons to fire again. All the while, the scientists were combing through alien databases, trying to understand the alien systems that would give them an edge. The first breakthrough came when Elias Munro, one of the colony's brightest minds, discovered an encrypted message hidden deep within the wreckage. It was a series of schematics for a weapon system unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was ancient, and the designs were complex. But it was a start. The humans weren't entirely without knowledge of alien tech, But this was different. This was the key to turning the sinking coffin into something far more powerful than any of them had anticipated. As Monroe and his team got to work deciphering the plans, the engineers focused on getting the ship's hull stable again. They had managed to reactivate most of the ship's primary systems, but the ship was still fragile. Its structure was weakened by years of neglect and decay. They couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The entire ship could fall apart at the slightest tremor. The work was grueling but necessary. Each day brought them closer to their goal, and with every victory they celebrated in silence. There was no time to waste, no time for joy, only the relentless push forward, knowing that with every fix they were building their weapon, but at the same time they were also building hope. Meanwhile, Hayes spent her days coordinating with the other human colonies scattered across the galaxy, trying to rally reinforcements to their cause. But the message was clear: no one was coming to save them. They were on their own with only what they could build and the strength of their will. The first test of their progress came sooner than expected when a Kelfar scout ship appeared on the outer rim of the system. It was small, a single vessel on a routine patrol, but it was a clear threat, a sign that the Kelfar were aware of the humans' activities. Hayes made the decision to move out and engage the ship, no longer willing to hide behind the wreckage of their new home. The crew sprang into action as the sinking coffin began to move for the first time in weeks. Its engines roared to life with a deep tremor and an eerie hum. The massive ship groaned as it broke free from its dock and moved slowly out into the cold void of space. Haze and the crew watched in awe as their efforts started to bear fruit. The ship wasn't fully ready, but it was enough for a test run. They had to see what it could do. The Kelfar scout ship approached, unaware of the trap that had been set for it. The sinking coffin may have been slow, but it had one advantage the Kelfar never anticipated. It was unpredictable. They didn't know what it could do or how fast it could strike, and it was time to show them. The first shot from the newly modified weapon system rang out a burst of energy unlike anything the Kelfar had ever seen. The scout ship was hit in the side and exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Hayes didn't wait for the debris to settle. She gave the order to return to the colony with the test complete. The sinking coffin was ready to be more than a symbol, it was a weapon. Cliffhanger: the success of the test did not go unnoticed. The Kelfar were no longer content to mock humanity. They knew now that the humans were not finished. They were a threat, and they would respond in kind. The success of the first strike sent shockwaves through the human fleet. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of the sinking coffin, staring out at the stars. As the ship drifted back to the colony, they had struck a blow against the Kelfar, and it had worked, but she knew the enemy would not let it go unpunished. They would be coming for them with everything they had. The scout ship was only the beginning. As the sinking coffin returned to the dock, the crew celebrated their victory, but it was short-lived. Hayes could see the worry in their eyes. They had won one battle, but the war was far from over. The Kelfar were known for their ruthlessness, and they wouldn't let a small defeat stop them. They would bring their full force down on humanity. The question was when the ship's sensors began picking up a fleet of Kelfar warships approaching at high speed. The first one was the size of a small city, and it was not alone. Behind it came several more, each one larger and more advanced than anything the humans had ever seen. They had come to wipe the humans off the map. Hayes turned to her crew and gave the orders without hesitation. They had no choice but to fight. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The crew sprang into action as they raced to finish final repairs and upgrades to the sinking coffin. The ship was no longer just a weapon, it was their only hope, and it had to work. As the Kelfar fleet drew closer, the sinking coffin was moved into position just outside the colony's protective atmosphere. The humans would fight there. It was their only chance. The plan was simple. They had to draw the Kelfar fleet into a trap and then hit them with everything they had. The sinking coffin was still a beast in the making, but it was strong enough to stand up to the Kelfar, at least for a while. The first exchange of fire was intense. The Kelfar launched volleys of energy weapons that streaked across the void. The humans returned fire with their own upgraded cannons. The newly repaired ship shook with each impact, but it held together. The weapon systems now worked flawlessly. The Kelfar didn't know what hit them. The sinking coffin was slow, but it wasn't predictable. The humans had made modifications to the ship's systems that allowed them to dodge and weave between the Kelthar's deadly fire. They used their knowledge of Kelthar technology to create blind spots in the enemy's targeting systems. Each shot fired by the Kelthar seemed to miss just enough to give the humans an edge. The battle raged on for hours. The humans took heavy damage, but they gave as good as they got. Hayes was a master strategist, and she used every trick she knew to keep the Kelthar guessing. The Kelthar began to grow frustrated as their attacks seemed to have little effect on the sinking coffin. They thought they were facing a weakened enemy, but instead they were met with a surprise. Just when it seemed the Kelthar fleet was about to overwhelm them, the humans struck back with the full force of their modified railgun. A massive shot fired from the heart of the sinking coffin tore through the center of a Kelthar destroyer, sending it spiraling into space. The explosion was so bright it illuminated the entire battlefield. It was the turning point of the battle. The Kelthar commander watched in disbelief as his fleet started to falter. The humans weren't giving up, they were fighting back. With everything they had, the sinking coffin had become something more than a symbol. It had become the tip of humanity's spear. The Kelthar were learning the hard way that humanity was not to be underestimated. Cliffhanger. But as the battle seemed to turn in their favor, Captain Hayes knew that the Kelthar wouldn't just leave, they would send reinforcements. And if they did, they would bring something far worse than anything the humans had faced so far. The battle had been a victory, but it came at a cost. The sinking coffin had taken heavy damage during the fight, and Captain Hayes knew it was only a matter of time before the Kelthar brought in reinforcements. They couldn't afford to wait. They had to be ready for the next wave. Hayes gathered her crew together in the command center to discuss their next move. They had bought themselves time, but the Kelthar would not be dissuaded. They would come for them again, and this time they would come with everything. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship and make the necessary upgrades. The most critical project was reinforcing the hull. It had withstood the battle, but it was barely holding together. Now the engineers focused on the damaged systems and worked on improving the ship's shields. The weapons were effective, but they needed to be more powerful. The humans needed a decisive advantage, something to tip the scales in their favor. Sir Elias Monroe and his team continued to explore the alien technology. Hidden within the ship, they found more weapons systems and advanced energy reactors that had once powered the Kelthar's greatest warships. If they could unlock the secrets of these systems, it could change everything. The humans had been working on borrowed time, and now they had a real chance to turn the sinking coffin into a true weapon of war. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Michael Davis began to organize the crew into specialized combat teams. They would need to be prepared for any situation. The Kelthar were relentless, and they wouldn't hesitate to launch a full assault on the colony if they knew the humans were ready for them. Davis trained his soldiers in the art of guerrilla warfare and defensive tactics. They couldn't rely solely on the sinking coffin. They would need to fight on the ground as well. As the crew worked to prepare for the inevitable, the tension on the ship grew. Everyone knew that the next battle would be the most dangerous, yet they couldn't afford to fail. Humanity's survival depended on it. Captain Hayes spent long hours in the command center staring at the star maps of the surrounding system. The Kelthar fleet was still on its way, but there was something else in the data that caught her attention, a new signal from deep space. It wasn't Kelthar, it was human. Hayes's heart raced as she realized what this could mean. Reinforcements had finally arrived, but they were far out of range. The message had come from a distant human colony that had managed to send a distress signal before being cut off. The transmission was faint, but it was enough to confirm that other human colonies were still out there, and they were coming to fight back. The sinking coffin wasn't just a symbol of resistance anymore. It was a beacon, a rallying point for all of humanity. Captain Hayes made the decision to send a response to the distant colony. She would not wait for the Kelthar to attack again. She would lead her crew to meet the reinforcements and unite their forces. They had a chance to strike back against the Kelthar and take the fight to their doorstep. But as the humans prepared to leave the colony, the threat they had feared began to materialize. A massive Kelthar warship appeared on the edge of the system. Its sheer size made the previous fleet seem like toys. The Kelthar had brought their ultimate weapon to bear, and Captain Hayes knew that this would be their greatest challenge. Yet the fight was far from over, and it was only going to get harder. Cliffhanger as the Kelfar warship began to close in on the colony. Captain Hayes knew there was no more time for preparation. It was now or never. They had to make their stand or be crushed beneath the weight of the Kelfar Empire. The massive Kelfar warship loomed on the edge of the colony's defensive perimeter. Its dark form blotted out the stars as it moved closer. The humans had never seen anything like it. The ship was a behemoth far larger than anything they had encountered. It was a living testament to the power of the Kelfar Empire, and it was heading straight for them. Captain Hayes stood at the command center, gripping the edge of her console. Her mind raced with possibilities. They had no choice now. They had to face it head-on. The crew scrambled to prepare for what was about to come. The sinking Coffin was battered and bruised, but it was all they had. Hayes gave the order to power up the weapons and reinforce the shields. They couldn't afford to let the Kelfar get close enough to strike the first blow. The ship's energy systems hummed to life, and the crew braced themselves for the coming fight. As the sinking Coffin moved to intercept the Kelfar ship, the crew's nerves were on edge, but their resolve was stronger than ever. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had survived. But this would be different. This ship was not just another enemy. It was the heart of the Kelfar fleet. The humans had to defeat it if they had any hope of surviving. The first wave of fire came from the Kelfar warship, a barrage of plasma beams that tore through the blackness of space and streaked toward the sinking Coffin. The impact shook the ship violently, sending crew members flying across the bridge. The walls groaned under the strain, but the ship held together. Hayes shouted orders to return fire. The modified railguns fired back with deadly precision, but the Kelfar ship's shields absorbed the shots with ease. The humans were outgunned and outclassed, but they refused to back down. The sinking Coffin was slow, but it had one advantage. The Kelfar didn't know what it could do. The humans had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was time to unleash everything they had. The crew launched their first missile barrage at the warship, each one laced with advanced human-made warheads designed to bypass the Kelfar's advanced shields. The missiles collided with the massive vessel, sending shockwaves through its hull, but it barely seemed to notice. The Kelfar responded with even more devastating firepower. This time, they targeted the sinking Coffin's engines and weapons systems, hoping to cripple it before the humans could retaliate. The ship was rocked by the blast, but once again it held firm. The shields flickered, but they didn't collapse. The humans had fortified the sinking Coffin with every ounce of technology and ingenuity they had, and it was enough to keep them alive. Meanwhile, on the ground, Lieutenant Davis and his combat teams were preparing for a potential invasion. The Kelfar had to know that the humans would be ready to fight back. They couldn't risk being caught off guard. The soldiers dug in and took their positions around the colony. They would hold the line for as long as possible, but Hayes knew that the real battle was in space. If they didn't stop the Kelfar warship, everything else would be irrelevant. The battle in space raged on, with both sides unleashing everything they had. The sinking Coffin continued to fire its weapons relentlessly, but it was clear that the Kelfar ship was far superior in terms of firepower and durability. Hayes gritted her teeth as she watched their weapons barely make a dent in the enemy's hull. She knew they couldn't keep this up for long. They needed something more, something to turn the tide. And then it came, the breakthrough. The scientists had managed to decode the last piece of alien technology hidden within the sinking Coffin. It was an experimental weapon system far more advanced than anything the humans had ever seen, and it was their last chance. Hayes gave the order to deploy it. The crew worked together in perfect synchronization to activate the weapon systems and aim them at the Kelfar warship. The energy that built up was unlike anything they had ever felt. The sinking Coffin's core hummed with power as the new weapon prepared to fire, and with a single shot it unleashed a burst of energy that pierced the Kelfar ship's shields and drilled straight through its hull. The warship shuddered and exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Cliffhanger as the Kelfar warship disintegrated into debris. Hayes knew that this victory wouldn't go unanswered. The enemy would regroup and strike back harder than before, but for now they had survived, and that was enough to keep the flame of hope alive. The explosion of the Kelfar warship sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The debris scattered across the stars as the humans watched the massive enemy vessel disintegrate before their eyes. Captain Hayes let out a breath she hadn't realized. She was holding the sinking coffin had delivered the final blow, but it was clear that the battle wasn't over. The Kelfar would regroup, and they would come again. This was only a temporary victory, and the humans knew it. On the ground, the soldiers were still bracing for an invasion. The Kelfar had been relentless in their pursuit, and Hayes knew they would not simply turn tail and run. No, the enemy would send in reinforcements, and it was only a matter of time before they attempted to land troops on the colony. Hayes turned to Lieutenant Davis, who was coordinating the ground forces. He had his soldiers preparing for the worst, but there was a fire in his eyes. He wasn't just preparing to hold the line, he was preparing to fight back, and that was something the Kelfar hadn't counted on. The humans were not only willing to fight, but they were starting to love the fight. They had something the Kelfar could never understand: the will to keep going no matter the cost. The sinking coffin's crew worked quickly to repair the ship's systems, while also preparing for another assault. The new weapon they had unlocked had given them the upper hand, but Hayes knew it was a double-edged sword. It was a last resort, and they couldn't afford to use it recklessly. Every shot they fired drained the ship's energy reserves, and each battle left them weaker than before. As the humans took stock of their situation, they saw that the Kelfar fleet had begun to retreat, but only to regroup and reassess. They had been defeated for now, but not destroyed. Hayes knew that in time the Kelfar would come again. They wouldn't let this insult go unanswered. The crew continued to repair the ship, but there was no joy in their work. The looming threat of the Kelfar's return weighed heavily on everyone. Hayes spent hours in the command center reviewing the data they had gathered from the battle, trying to find any advantage they could exploit. She knew that their survival depended on outthinking the enemy, not just outgunning them, and that would take time. Back on the ground, Lieutenant Davis led his teams in fortifying the colony's defenses. The Kelfar were likely to send a ground assault sooner or later, and the humans had to be ready. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The soldiers were no strangers to battle, but this would be different. The Kelfar weren't just another enemy. They were an empire that had crushed civilizations without mercy, and now they were facing the most dangerous foe of all, a species that refused to die. Meanwhile, Monroe and his team were studying the data they had collected from the Kelfar shipwreck. They had found valuable information about the Kelfar's weaknesses and their technology. The humans had learned a great deal from the battle, and now they had to use that knowledge to their advantage. They couldn't just rely on brute force. They had to be clever. They had to be resourceful. The sinking coffin had become more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of humanity's resilience. It had shown the galaxy that humans were not to be underestimated. They had defeated a Kelfar warship against all odds, but Hayes knew that the hardest part was still to come. They had made their stand, but the war was far from over. The Kelfar would return, and next time they would come with everything they had. Cliffhanger. Hayes stood at the bridge of the sinking coffin, staring out at the stars. She knew the Kelfar wouldn't rest until they had eradicated humanity, but she was also certain of one thing: the humans wouldn't let them win, not without a fight. The days following the battle were filled with tense anticipation. The sinking coffin had taken a momentary breath after the destruction of the Kelfar warship, but that breath was fleeting. Hayes and her crew knew that the enemy would not give up so easily. The Kelfar Empire was vast, and their resolve was as unyielding as the stars themselves. There was no time for rest. The war was still very much alive. The crew worked tirelessly to keep the sinking coffin operational. Each day brought new challenges. Repairs seemed endless, and even the smallest of mistakes could spell disaster. But despite the strain, Hayes could see a renewed sense of purpose in their eyes. They had seen what the humans were capable of, and they had learned to never underestimate their will to survive. On the ground, Lieutenant Davis continued to train the soldiers, preparing them for the worst. The Kelfar had always favored overwhelming force, and Davis knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. Every soldier was drilled in the brutal tactics of survival. Their strength now lay in their ability to adapt and strike quickly. They had to turn the colony into a fortress and make it a place that the Kelfar would fear to land on. Back in the command center, Monroe and his team worked to decipher more of the alien tech they had recovered during the battle. They had unlocked a treasure trove of information about the Kelfar's weaknesses and their battle strategies. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Hayes needed something more. They needed an edge, something that could tip the scales in humanity's favor once and for all. It was during one of these long nights that Monroe made a breakthrough. The alien tech contained not just weapons schematics, but something even more valuable, a navigation system that could pinpoint weak points in the Kelfar fleet. The Kelfar were powerful, but their fleet was not invincible. This technology could give the humans the exact information they needed to target the heart of the enemy's strength. The humans were not just fighting to survive anymore, they were fighting to win. And with this new advantage, Hayes felt the first spark of hope. For the first time since the war began, she believed they could actually take the fight to the Kelfar and come out on top. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was possible. As they worked to implement this new system, the sinking Coffin sensors picked up a new fleet on the horizon. But this time it wasn't a warship, it was something different. It was a messenger, a small craft carrying a single envoy from the Kelfar Empire. Hayes watched the transmission on the main screen as the envoy's image flickered into focus. The Kelfar representative's voice was cold and emotionless. The message was simple. They wanted to negotiate terms of surrender. They demanded that the humans stand down and submit to the Empire or face total destruction. Hayes didn't flinch. She had heard this before. The Kelfar would never allow humanity to exist on its own terms. They wouldn't negotiate, they would destroy and conquer, and she knew it. With a calm voice, Hayes responded. She told the envoy that humanity would never surrender, that they would fight to the last breath, that they would not be cowed by threats or intimidation. The message ended with a simple declaration: "We are humanity, and we will fight back." The envoy's response was chilling. The Kelfar would not stop until every human colony was wiped from existence. They would bring every resource and every weapon to bear, and they would crush the humans once and for all. But Hayes wasn't intimidated. This was what they had been preparing for. This was the war they had been destined to fight. Cliffhanger. The messenger ship turned to depart, and as it did, Hayes knew that the next battle would be the most dangerous. Yet the Kelfar weren't just making threats anymore. They were gearing up for their final assault, and humanity would need every ounce of strength it had to survive. The days after the Kelfar envoy's message were filled with an air of inevitable tension. The sinking Coffin was as ready as it could be. The crew had pushed themselves beyond their limits, and every repair, every upgrade had been completed just in time. Hayes knew this would be their final stand. There would be no more chances. The Kelfar were coming for them with everything they had, and this time they wouldn't back down. The crew continued to prepare for the battle of their lives. Hayes held private meetings with her officers, each one preparing for the worst, yet holding on to the hope that they could survive. Their will to resist was their greatest weapon. She knew that even in the darkest hour, the human spirit could not be broken. On the ground, Lieutenant Davis's forces were ready to defend the colony at all costs. The soldiers had trained for this moment. They had spent weeks learning every corner of the colony's defenses. Each soldier was positioned at strategic locations, and they knew the Kelfar's tactics well. They wouldn't be caught off guard this time. As the battle drew near, the sinking Coffin moved into position just beyond the protective shield of the colony's atmosphere. Hayes stood on the bridge once more, staring at the stars that surrounded them. She had no illusions about what was to come. The Kelfar would not show mercy. They would bring their full might down upon them. But the humans had something the Kelfar lacked. They had heart. The first wave of Kelfar ships appeared on the edge of the system. Their numbers were overwhelming. The fleet was composed of multiple dreadnoughts and destroyers far larger than anything the humans had faced. Before Hayes could feel the weight of the moment in her chest, she had fought against impossible odds before, but this would be different. The Kelfar had sent their entire force to wipe them out. The sinking Coffin fired first, launching its full array of weapons at the incoming fleet. The railguns hummed as they unleashed their deadly payload. The energy weapons from the ship's modified turrets blazed through space, streaking toward the enemy targets. But even as the first ships exploded in flashes of light, it was clear that the humans were outgunned. The Kelfar ships absorbed the fire and kept coming. But Hayes refused to surrender. She ordered the crew to push every system to its limit. They fired continuously, hoping to break through the Kelthar's formidable defenses. Each shot was a desperate attempt to halt their advance. The ship shook under the force of repeated impacts, but it held together as the humans fought with every ounce of strength they had on the ground. Davis's soldiers engaged the Kelthar's ground forces as they began their assault on the colony. The battle was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the streets as the humans fought to protect their homes. The Kelthar were relentless, but the humans had something the enemy did not: a deep-rooted determination to survive no matter the cost. In space, the battle grew more chaotic as the Kelthar fleet spread out and launched volleys of their own energy weapons. The sinking Coffin fired relentlessly, trying to hold the line, but with each passing minute the human ship seemed to falter. Its shields weakened, and the hull cracked under the barrage of enemy fire. Hayes knew that they couldn't keep this up for long. They needed a plan. Monroe's team activated the final phase of their weapon system. They had one shot left, and it was humanity's last hope: a powerful energy beam that could pierce the heart of the Kelthar's fleet. The energy gathered in the core of the sinking Coffin, and with one final command, Hayes fired. The beam tore through space and struck the heart of the Kelthar flagship. A massive explosion erupted, sending shockwaves through the fleet. The Kelthar flagship shattered into pieces as the beam overloaded its systems. The humans watched in awe as the massive vessel broke apart. The Kelthar fleet staggered and began to retreat. But Hayes knew this victory was bittersweet. The battle had cost them dearly, and the Kelthar were not finished yet. They would regroup and return. But for now, humanity had held its ground against a seemingly unstoppable force. They had survived, and as the sinking Coffin limped back to the colony, Hayes knew this was only the beginning of the fight for their future. Cliffhanger. The skies above the colony were clear for now, but the war was far from over. Hayes could feel the weight of the struggle ahead, but as long as humanity stood together, they would fight for their place in the stars.